Hello, my name is Mike McKee, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about building macros in Alteryx. There are several kinds of macros that you can build in Alteryx. Today, we're going to be focused on the standard macro and a lot of the bells and whistles around it, so that when we get into the more advanced macros in subsequent trainings, those bells and whistles will just follow along and be a part of it. All right, so attached to this training, I have some input files for you. I've got the standard macro start, which is what we're looking at here. Double click this or go to file and open it. I've got the standard macro complete, which is the finished version of this. And then I have the actual macro that we're going to build, right? So you can play with any of these. I also have a graphic up here that we're going to use a little bit later. And we're not going to put anything into the output, but as always, I have a place for structured output as well. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So I've opened the standard macro start file, and I'm going to run it. And I've just got a little text file, right, a text input, which has just got some transaction amounts of dollars, Great Britain pounds. And then I've got a formula tool, and the formula tool is just taking the transaction amount and multiplying it times a conversion. In this particular example right here, I'm converting it to USD. Now, the actual conversions, it's just a number. I'm not worried about it. I'm sure it's not accurate at this point. This is really more just for illustrations, and that's why I have a very simple workflow. But when you're building a macro, it can be much more complex than this. And then I've got an output, which is just viewing my results. Right, so pretty simple. Input, modifications, output. Now, to start, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to duplicate this workflow. Right, so now I've got a copy of it. Now, with the copy of the workflow, there's a couple of advantages to doing it this way. Since I actually have input currency, I'm going to go ahead and right click this, and I can convert that to an input macro. And what that does is that changes this to be the input. I can use the output right here and do the exact same thing, convert to macro output. Now, the nice thing about this is that when I convert this to the macro input, it automatically brings in some sample data, which is the data that I had on there. If I was connected to a file, it would have automatically connected to the file. But what it does is it brings in data so that you can start playing with the macro. I can now run this, and when I run it, it's actually going to show me information based upon what I brought in. Now, I'm going to go over to the interface section here, not a section we've talked about before. And this is where all the macro stuff is, right? Macro input, macro output. I could have also drug a macro output down on the canvas, and I could have connected it up. And then I could have just pointed it to data or whatnot. I do recommend that you point it to some sample data, because if you don't point it to sample data, you can't actually run the workflow, right, when you're building it. Oftentimes when you're doing these things and you already have a workflow pre-built, and you're just trying to convert that workflow into a macro. Now, I could have multiple inputs, I could have multiple outputs, I could have an extremely complex workflow if I wanted to. And with the standard macros, one of the things that I recommend is to build your workflow. Once you have your workflow working, then convert it to a macro. So I've converted this to a macro here. I'm going to go ahead and do a file save and save as, browse. And I go ahead and navigate to where I'm going to save things. Okay. In my situation here, I'm going to go to my new volume, standard macro training, and I'm going to just copy, I'm going to save it to currency converter 2. And I'm going to save that. Right. Note that we have that name here. Because I have this macro opened in my designer on a second tab, I can come back to my original file here. I can right click the canvas. I can find a tool. Oops, sorry. I can insert a tool. I can go down to macro, and there's my macro right there. So I go ahead and select that, and there's the macro that I just built. Go ahead and hide this. Here's the macro that I just built. I can go ahead and connect it up, and if I hit run, you can see the output of this macro is exactly like the output of this macro, literally. All right, so that is the fundamentals of building a standard macro, right? Take the workflow that you're looking at, go ahead and duplicate it, change your input to the input, and you might have multiple. Output to the output, you might have multiple. Save it as the macro. Notice that it's a YXMC, which is the macro extension, versus YXMD, which is a standard workflow. All right. Now, one of the things that I can also do with this is when I'm looking at my standard input, I can have an anchor abbreviation, right? And I'm going to call this I, right? Unfortunately, you can only put single characters in there. And for the output, I'm going to make that O. Okay. Now, note that I get the asterisk because I've changed the workflow, and you'll see this was standard with all of them. I go ahead and save it. Asterisk goes away. When I click on a workflow that has that macro, it's going to automatically tell me the macro's been changed and we're refreshing it. And now what you'll note is I have the I and the O anchors on my macro. So I recommend that when you're building your macros to put some kind of an anchor abbreviation, which will allow you, when you have, especially if you have multiple inputs and multiple outputs, to go ahead and identify which ones they are. For example, I could pull down a macro output here, put a second macro output on it, and maybe I do something different with this data or whatnot. And I'm going to call this Q. Well, okay, make it L so it's completely different. And when I save that, I go to the macro standard, it's changed, and now you can see I have those two outputs. Right? So lots of ways of modifying it. Again, this is just for an example of what I'm doing. You probably have more tools in here doing more complex things. Go ahead and save that again. So when you're looking at the input, what it's doing is it is looking for a specific column, right? In this case, output in USD. And it's actually manipulating with that column so that when you're sending something into here, it has to be called output in USD. Well, sometimes that can be problematic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say show field map here and save that. And now when I look at how the macro is going to respond, when I have my macro, I've now got a drop down on it, which I can select a field here. And now I can select that transaction amount. And in this case, it could be anything that you want. So let me go ahead and duplicate this. And I will hook that up directly. And I'm going to go ahead and change the header for this. I'm going to call it test. Now, I need to map that field into my macro. And now when I hit run, it maps that field to the field that I'm looking for. And so now the macro can work with any inputs. If you don't map the field, then you have to make sure that all of your inputs match exactly what's already listed in the macro. The other option we have here is optional incoming connection. And not all macros will necessarily have an input. I've seen standard macros created where it is actually a database connection. And so there's no input to it. It's pulling your data directly. And so what that does is that gives you a gray input anchor. Right? So say you don't have to necessarily have to put an input into it. You don't even have to have an input. If I deleted this, you delete that input anchor. So a lot of flexibility into how to build the macros, as many inputs and as many outputs as you want. You could have 0 outputs because maybe this writes up to a database or something like that. So again, just a simple and easy example. All right. Now, this is the basics of the macro. If I go into options and I come down, so I go into view and I come down to interface designer, it opens up a new window for me here. Open that up. And the interface designer gives you a little bit of information and some flexibility as to what you can do with your macro as a whole. Right? I can move questions around. So right now I'm just choosing that field, but as we'll see later, if there were other things, I could move them around. The properties is where it gets a little more interesting. Right? When I am looking at my standard right here, it's just this kind of gray circle. But what I can do is I could change that to something else if I wanted to. Maybe I like that icon. If I go ahead and save that, we go ahead and delete this. And let me go ahead and insert a tool, pull that macro on again. And you can see that, well, it takes a minute to kick in, but you can see that on the right here, it's represented as that. And like I said, it'll take a little bit, but eventually it will kick in and it will be that new icon. In addition, instead of using that, I could use a custom icon. So if I go ahead and browse for that custom icon, I go into my graphic and I use that currency formatter and I open that. That will be my new icon. So I save that. Right, you can see now it's changed to the new one. And since I did change this, I select my field to test field. If I go, let me save that. All right, so again, eventually this will change and it'll be that icon. We'll see it come up in a few minutes. So a couple things I can do: reorganize the questions, change some of the properties. You could also attach like a help file to it. You don't need to worry about this at this point, but be aware that if your output fields change or something, you might want to check that if you have any problems with it. You'll see this a little bit more with the iterative and the batch macros. All right. So let's go ahead and hide this. One of the other aspects with the macros that people like to use is if I click on the white space on the canvas and I cruise up to metadata, you'll notice that I can actually configure this particular tool. For the macro, which is called currency converter because it's using the file name, but I could create a custom name for it. Maybe I don't want it to be currency converter, I want it to be something else. I can put a description for it. I can create a URL link, text display. Now, the tool settings are interesting because I can go ahead and put a root tool name, and then as I change versions, it'll keep all that together. For the tool palette, I can determine where I want this tool located. By default, you'll have a macros folder down here, and all of your macros will appear in that macros folder. But I could say, I want this to be in a different folder. I want this to be in my preparation. And so you type in preparation here. And that macro will now appear in your preparation. You could do search tags, and so that when you search in the search bar, it'll pull up this macro. And of course, you can give yourself credit: name, company, copyright, things like that. Right? So this sets information about the macro as a whole. Now, the way that you get all this to work is that I go ahead and take this macro, currency converter, and I'll go to options. I will go to my user settings, edit my user settings, and I'm on version 25.1, so your user settings might be a little bit different. But when I scroll down here, I've got a whole bunch of different configuration options that I could use. Right? Now, one of the configuration options is macros. And when I roll down here, I can set a macro folder. Any macros that I put in this folder, when I start Alteryx, will automatically be brought into my system. And that's kind of the big benefit of the macros, is that you're creating a reusable process. You're basically building a tool. You will put that tool out somewhere. Other people will point to that location. So I recommend a network share or something along those lines. And then every single time they start their workflow or start their browser, then Alteryx will automatically bring in those macros and they'll have access to them. Now, I recommend putting permissions on this so the people that are actually building the macros have read-write permissions so they can edit the macros and things like that. The people that are only using the macros only have read permissions. So you get the people that read-write, modify them, change them, enhance them, whatnot. The people that are using them can only use them and not actually modify them or change them at all. As you can see in my macros folder over here, I've got a whole variety of different macros in that folder that I can use in a variety of circumstances. I can just drag them down and use them as a tool. Right? So this really expands the capabilities of Alteryx by allowing you to take things that you do on a regular basis and really roll those functions, concepts, techniques out to a wide array of people without having them being forced to rebuild it each and every time. Now, while we're on this right here, one of the things I'd like to point out is that in the workflow tab here, this has been changed to a standard macro. There are other macros, and we'll talk about those in later classes. But generally, when you're looking at a workflow, your standard workflow, Analytic Apps is another class that we'll talk about. And then, of course, you have your macros as well. Right? And they all have different extensions with them. All right, so we can modify the metadata, which gives you more descriptive capabilities and things like that. You can put it in different tool categories. You can go ahead and you can change the icon, when appropriate. And then, when you run it, it just works. Go ahead and map the field. So you have that option to go ahead and map the fields. So that is the fundamentals of the batch macro. Sorry, of the standard macro. Now, one of the things that I'd like to point out here is there are a couple of features that go along with the macros that can make things a little bit better for you. Right? So we've just built that standard macro to the single currency. We've talked about Interface Designer. We've talked about the macros directory. I would like to add an analytic app to it. Now, what analytic apps will allow you to do is modify your workflow based upon input. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to figure out what I want to modify. And I'm going to have a drop-down box for this example. Right? There is a course on analytic apps that goes into a lot more detail on how these work. Two ways of connecting it. You can connect it directly to the magnifying glass to the magnifying glass. And when I'm in my formula tool, the information that comes down here will now appear under connections from questions. Now, the disadvantage to this is that it's not an actual value, it's a variable that gets pulled in. So when you hit run, it's not always going to run because there isn't an actual value there. It is a variable. What I can also do is if I connect this to the lightning bolt, it automatically puts an update value tool in here, which is the action tool right here to update the values in the tool. When I configure this action tool, it's actually looking inside the tool it's connected to, whatever that tool is, and it's looking at how things are configured, right? Now I can configure, or I can change any part of this configuration. In my situation, I'm going to go ahead and just update a value, but you do have some other options in there. I'm going to update this expression, but I don't want to update the whole expression, right? Which is the transaction multiplied times this number, right? Which you can see down here. And I could if I wanted to. I'm going to replace the specific string, and I'm only going to replace the number itself, the currency conversion. All right. Now I go into my dropdown, and my dropdown's got a couple of configuration options. Right. I'm going to just talk about the simplest right here. But in some of the subsequent classes, I do get into a lot more advanced configuration for this. So when you are listing your values, you could use an external source, name values. You could do a connected tool, which is really powerful if you want to parse the items actually in your workflow and only give them options that are in your workflow. I'm going to go ahead and manually set values. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set name value pairs here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy this right here and then edit it. And I'll paste that into here, right? Converting to these kind of things. So I've got converting to the dollar, and there's my currency conversion, converting to the yen, my currency conversion, converting to Ethereum, there's my currency conversion. All right. Now, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now, when I go to my macros here, it's changed, and you can see that this has come down now. And what I have is I have that drop down here. Well, I didn't name it right. Let me go ahead and rename that. Go into the drop down. I don't want it named drop down 7. I want it named currency. Currency conversion. And now you'll note that that says currency conversion. And I have my 3 choices. What do I want to convert it to? Let's say I want to convert it to Ethereum. And now when I run it, you'll note it's still got that column header, and I could be a little more advanced about this, and I could take some of those values and I could put it in there and get the columns changed and stuff. But note that these are very, very different than my original currency conversions. Because what it's doing is it's looking at the dropdown and it's saying, okay, that was the words that you saw. That is the number that this action tool is going to change this number to. So I've got my basic formula. I say, that is the number that I'm going to convert. I put my action tool in here, and I point it to what I want converted. And then I have my drop down, which says, okay, these are the words that you're going to present to my users, and then a colon, and then these are the actual values that are going to be inserted into that field. So I've got my standard macro now, which has the fields that I'm going to put in, and then what I want to convert them to. And you'll note that when I open my interface designer here, I've got a little bit more, whoops, I got to go to my macro. I have a little bit more options here. I've got my field up here. I've got my currency conversion down here. I could switch them around if I wanted to. You know, let's move the currency conversion all the way to the top, right? You can add grouping boxes, labels. There's a variety of things that you can do here, and I get more into that, more in depth into that later. This is not a class on the Analytic Apps. This is just a flavor for the standard macro itself. And so when I move this up here, I go ahead and save it. And I'll hide this. And when I come back to my standard macro, you'll notice now conversion is on top and what field I want to convert is down below. And so that I can modify this a little bit, I can even add a second page of questions depending upon what I'm doing. Again, this is just a very simple one, just to kind of get the basic concepts of the standard macro across. So, start with your workflow, duplicate it, convert the inputs and the outputs as appropriate, add whatever analytical apps that you might want. Also, when you're looking at the input, don't forget to show the field map, right? That way you can map as appropriate. Multiple inputs, multiple outputs, label them with anchor abbreviations to keep them straight. Don't forget you need to save the macro. When you go back here, it'll always pop this up. The thing to note is that when you've modified your macro and then come back and that doesn't pop up, that tells you that you forgot to save it. Okay. So that really covers the basics of the macro. Under options, user settings, you're going to have your location to store your macros, right? And that'll allow you to put them out there and then bring them in. Under your view, you have your interface designer, which gives you configuration options for the macro. And then when you're on the white space in the canvas, you've got your metadata to be able to decide where you want your macro to reside, names, search, things of that nature. And that right there will allow you to build a nice macro. Now, to give you an example of just what's possible here, I'm going to drag down a data cleansing tool. And you note that there's a little plus button at the bottom, and that tells me it's a macro. Now, this is the same with any of our macros. If I right-click the macro, I can open the macro, and I can see how it's built. And this right here is that macro. I've got a little input right here, which is pulling its information from the input data. What fields do I want to cleanse? It takes those out. There's a couple of action tools there, which come down to other tools here to do things. Right here, I'm removing all the null rows. I'm removing all the null columns. And it's going into those action tools to turn off these detours, right? Which just say, if it's on, take this path. If it's off, go down, and there's another macro down here, which is going to remove the null rows, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is a complicated macro. It does a lot of different things, but it kind of illustrates a more complex version of what we just built. When you look at this macro, there's removing the null rows, removing the null columns. It would pull the fields to clean if I had something connected to it. And all these checkboxes were just different options that were configured in there. When I look at my macro here, I can right-click this, and there is open macro exactly like we had. I open that, and here it is right here. Right, so I can actually close this. I think it was already open. And then open it. And I can see how that macro was built, change the macro, save it, whatever. So that's the nuts and bolts, the ins and outs, the basics of building the macros. In the following courses, we will build some more complex macros. And in the Analytics Apps courses, we'll talk about adding a lot of different tools to it and how to work with a lot of the different things in the interface section. So I hope this was enjoyable. I hope you guys learned about, a bit about the macros and building the macros. Any questions, reach out and let me know. Thank you.